So we hear that you are a space farmer.
Yeah, that's one of the titles that I've been given with the work that I do.
Can you tell us a little about that?
Yeah. So pretty much, we currently have this open question about space agriculture. For decades now, we've had people who have been interested in sending humans into space. That could be having people living on the moon or on Mars, or even going further. We've even had movies and science fiction novels that talk about humans going out into space and exploring and seeing if we can find other life like yourselves out in our solar system and our universe. But one
Well,
of
you
the
you
open,
found us, so what are you gonna do now?
yeah, well,
Mission
you know,
accomplished.
Go
you
home
know,
early.
we'll just check that right off the list.
Excellent.
But yeah, we definitely want to see if there's other living people and beings out in the universe. But to do that, we need to answer this question of how are we going to feed ourselves? Whether we're living on a planet or going out further in a spacecraft. And so, as a space farmer, I am a scientist who helps do research and development to see if we can answer these questions of how we can grow plants on spacecraft as well as on in the soil of the moon or on Mars.
Well, it seems like it's pretty straightforward, no? You just kind of put them in the ground and they go?
It's a little bit more complicated than that. It's something that we've had thousands of years to develop here on Earth. If you don't know already, humans pretty much came from a hunter-gatherer society. And eventually we got to the point where we started to transition into agriculture in certain parts of the world. Some people remained hunter-gatherers. And so we see this transition into agriculture and we realize how amazing and how important agriculture is to be able to pretty much build communities and be able to survive, especially when we have disturbances happen, whether a storm comes through and wreaks havoc with our local ecosystem, or we have a pest come through that kills a lot of the plants around us. And so being able to have a system that we can fall back on and be able to create an agricultural system that we can survive off of is very important. But it's taken us thousands of years to get to this point. And as we see currently with our agricultural systems, we have some successes, but we are also having some difficulties as well. And some of those difficulties have to deal with the soil, where we've been using these intensive agricultural practices that have led to the soil actually degrading over time. And it leads to things such as desertification, which is where land that used to be arable that could support plants is now becoming more desert-like, and we can't really grow plants there. And so there's a lot of questions and research that's being done to see how we can create more sustainable agricultural systems that support the local environment so that we don't get to this point where we actually continue to lose arable land.
Well, so what if humans stopped eating plants and just ate like nutrient pellets?
Like, would it be cheaper?
Would you?
Well, I mean, I feel like deep space, let's say you go to Mars, right?
Mm-hmm.
Where you humans do this thing, what is it, backpacking?
Mm-hmm.
So you've developed this complex civilization, and now some people go and they live in a tent in the woods for a couple days. Have you heard of this, Mickey?
They do it for fun.
Yeah, they do it for fun. And when humans do this thing, they don't eat regular food, right?
Like they don't grow crops.
Well, yeah, they're not like taking like leafy vegetables and stuff with them. They're basically eating food pellets, right?
Well, yeah, people take granola bars. They take things that are easy to carry that are nutrient dense when they're on these expeditions that they're doing. But just think about this. If you're going to be living the rest of your life somewhere, do you want to just be eating granola bars that entire time?
Depends what they taste like.
That is a really good point.
I would want mine to be flavored like worms, personally.
I think that there's something deeper here, right? It's not even about the food. It's about being able to have some of Earth with you, right? It's like almost like taking history with you when you go to a different planet.
The thing that makes the food.
Yeah, and that's part of food culture. We come from families and we come from communities and cultures that have all these years of eating certain foods and developing recipes, and we grow up in that. And so we have our comfort foods. We have foods that we love to eat. It's like you put it in your mouth and it brings you joy, or it sparks a memory for you. And so when we think about that, it would be very difficult for people to go from being able to have access to food like that to just eating 1-2 things for the rest of their lives. And we see in psychology that people who undergo this transition into just eating 1 or 2 things results in them having menu fatigue, which is when a person, after pretty much eating the same thing for a long period of time, becomes depressed or gets to a state where they just stop eating because it isn't appetizing for them anymore, and there's a response in our brains that can lead to that feeling of fatigue.
Does it matter? Sorry, does it matter what they're eating? Like, because I've eaten the same pile of rocks for, I don't know, like 2 years now, and I can imagine getting tired of this pile of rocks if it was any other pile of rocks. Like if it wasn't plutonium, I think I wouldn't be able to do it. If it was like gallium or something, that stuff's gross. But plutonium, I could just go for years eating the same thing. Like, does it matter what you're eating? Does everybody get fatigue off of it? Are you trying to threaten me, Mickey? What are you doing?
I'm just working on my beard.
Okay, sorry.
That's a very nice beard, I must say.
Thank you.
Yeah, you have a very good point, because there are definitely cultures here on Earth where there are people who eat rice at every meal, people who eat very similar things at every meal, because that's just what their culture eats. And that's the local ecology that they have for their food sources. But when we think about it, you may have items that you eat every day, but you still have the opportunity to spice it up a little bit, you could say. You can add some vegetables. You can have different kinds of meat if you're a meat eater. You can add those different spices. I know I need to have spices in my food. If I had to eat bland food for the rest of my life, we would have an issue. So, yes.
So it sounds like there's like a spiritual component to this. It's like you're trying to nurture we can say psychological if it's more scientific on Earth, but there's like this motivational aspect to eating that you want to transplant into your future habitats on other planets. This comfort, this sense of well-being.
Yes, definitely. That's a part of it. When we're talking about all of the services that an ecosystem provides, which are called ecosystem services, one of the categories that we look at is the cultural services. And these cultural services that an ecosystem, which could be a food system, provides to a human is not only like the physical well-being, but also the spiritual side as well, because there are people in religions and cultures that have a spiritual connection with their ecological systems, with the food that they eat. And so we have to consider that when we're going out into space as well, especially if we're bringing people from many different cultures. We want to be able to provide everyone with those cultural services that an ecosystem would provide if they were living at home here on Earth.
Do all the humans have a spiritual connection to their food?
Not necessarily. Some people may think that you just eat it to survive, and some people can eat anything, no matter what it is. They really don't have a preference. But there's also that element of just like memory connected with food, where it's like you eat that certain thing and it brings up a memory from your childhood, or a person that you met, where you met them when you were eating a meal, or you having a conversation with them when you're eating a meal. So it's not necessarily a specific food that you have a spiritual connection with, but it can, again, trigger a memory when you're eating it that can give you comfort, that can just bring positive emotions into your life.
What if triggering those memories when you're 20 million miles from Earth is actually worse for your well-being than if you just ate food pellets?
Yeah, that's a very good question.
Right? If you're like, everyone
yeah.
I know and love is going to die 20 million miles away from me. That might be hard.
Yeah, and that's something that people have to really consider when they're thinking about going into space. The explorers that go out into space, it's like maybe there'll be a return trip where you can eventually come back to Earth. Maybe there might not be. And of course, there's always the risk and dangers that come with space exploration. So you really have to consider that. And one of the things that I work on with space agriculture is bringing that ecological system with you into space, so that when you are living, i.e., in a habitation module on Mars, you may have your, what I call a quasi-closed agroecological system that you go out into, and it looks like a natural ecological system from Earth. And that in itself can give some comfort to you because it has that familiarity in an unfamiliar landscape.
That seems like a beautiful vision.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So then I guess the next question is, now that I'm sold on the idea of space farms, what's the difficulty of actually doing it?
Ooh.
You're like, where do I begin?
Oh, yes. It really is a difficult challenge. It's something that really hit the research sphere in the 1960s, starting in the 1960s.
Whoa, people have been thinking about this since the 1960s? That seems early.
They were way into space back then.
That's true, but
yeah,
only like 10 of them ever went, right?
We've had a few more than 10 people go into space.
Well, in the 1960s, like in the 1960s.
Oh,
I still think
so
dozens. Not that I know.
Yeah.
Sorry, we have the expert here. Sorry.
No, it's all good. At that point, I believe we were still in the single digits. Maybe we were in the teens at that point, but I'm actually forgetting.
Well, that's what we like about you,
the
humans.
number of humans. Yeah.
You guys plan ahead, you know? You're planners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, yeah, like I was saying, this research into closed ecological systems for space habitation, which a closed ecological system would pretty much be that closed loop agricultural system that you would be pulling on for your food. That research began really in the 1960s in Soviet Union, Russia.
Mm.
So they were doing experiments called the BIOS experiments. And it's important to actually point out that the idea of closed ecological systems actually predated the research. So the idea has to come from somewhere. Where could it have possibly come from? And it was actually, I believe, in 1896.
Whoa.
I would have to fact check myself real quick. 1895. Okay, yes.
I like that you have that right there.
Yep. I have some notes just to fact check myself on some dates.
So responsible.
Yep. So in 1895, Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, he published his work, Dreams of Earth and Sky, which had some of the first detailing information about the use of plants in space exploration, which is fascinating because this literary figure, this writer, he was also considered the father of rocketry and the father of space exploration. So he was actually a scientist as well. So he not only did science, but he also wrote books. And I actually have one of his books right here.
Oh,
it's in Russian. And this is Dreams of Earth and Sky.
It's a pretty picture
this
there,
is
too.
Yeah, that picture is The Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh from 1889. This book has some of the first writings on the possibility of having plants grown in space. And so
he was a sci-fi writer?
He was pretty much writing about what space exploration could look like. So you could say that it was sci-fi because he was ahead of his time, but he was also working on the science and the engineering behind it as well. So he was kind of merging that together. But we know that how important sci-fi writing has been to just showing what reality could be. And that drives a lot of the science that we're seeing.
That comes up over and over again with the scientists we talk to. It's really interesting. All the human scientists really love sci-fi. It's like the outlet of their dreaming.
Yeah. Like you have to be able to dream to be able to even ask a question. You have to be able to think outside the box and think of what could be to be able to take a step forward. And so sci-fi has, as well as fantasy, just like these entire writing genres have given people the opportunity to kind of step out of the physical societal bounds of society and see what could be, and then take that imagination, take those inklings of ideas and start putting them into experiments, putting them into practice. I mean, just like even a decade ago, we wouldn't have really thought that you could shoot off a rocket and then re-land the booster right back on the ground here on Earth. And yet we're now doing that. And some of the first depictions of this were in sci-fi writings and sci-fi movies. And now we're seeing it in reality.
Well, there's something to be said about being able to imagine the vision of the future. As long as you can imagine it as possible, then why not pursue it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And so the roots of space agriculture go back to the 1890s. You have, what was his name again?
Konstantin Tsiolkovsky.
Tsiolkovsky. Okay. So Tsiolkovsky is writing about space agriculture. And he's talking about what? Like moon bases or Mars bases? Or what's he imagining?
So he was looking at spacecraft. So looking at growing plants on spacecraft that kind of look like the International Space Station a little bit. These places where humans would live and work and be able to be completely self-sustaining.
And they have just regular farms in his imagination? Or they're special?
So there's definitely some specialization that happens. And with the experiments done in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s with the BIOS experiments of Soviet Union, Russia, their experiments were mostly testing what we call hydroponics systems, where stepping away from soil and using instead an engineered system that pushes water through the roots of these plants and has a nutrient solution in it. So the plants are still getting the nutrients that they need, but in just a water form. And I, of course, have a little bit of mixed feelings with hydroponic systems and all that, but I
Very nice.
so well, I'm a soil scientist as well. So when I look at hydroponic systems and soil science systems and think about the context of space exploration, I can see an integrated system. So I really think that we should have what I call a field ponics system, where you have field agriculture, but also you integrate hydroponic systems, other engineered systems, because I see a benefit for both of those. But we have to keep in mind that with hydroponic systems and systems like that, one of their key elements is that they try to maintain a completely sterile system, which means they try to make sure that no microorganisms contaminate their system. And this can be very dangerous because a lot of those microorganisms that are naturally supposed to be there with their roots and usually provided with the soil provide protection to the system. And so if you take the protectors away and suddenly an invading microorganism gets its way into the system and starts blossoming, well, there's nobody there to protect it. And it can actually lead to your system failing because it kills the crops, or it leads to huge biofilm creation in the piping system. Another way to think about this, with humans, we have a microbiome, which means we have microorganisms living on our skin. We have microorganisms living in our gut, in our digestive system. And all these microorganisms living on us pretty much help us stay healthy and help us digest our food and do things like that. Of course, sometimes we have microorganisms that can cause some health issues, but much of the time, the microorganisms that we're living symbiotically with are helping us.
Because they're in balance with one another too, right?
Exactly. Yep. It's a very, it can be a very precarious situation, but we've pretty much evolved over the generations, over the years, to have pretty balanced systems. Now imagine a human who has no gut microbiome, their microbiome has been completely wiped out. Yeah, like that. Well, when we see that happen here on Earth, it leads to a lot of immuno problems. Their immune systems can start to pretty much freak out a bit. And it can lead to problems with your digestive system and other health problems. And it's because that microbiome that was helping to regulate your health and helping to keep your body in kind of this healthy stasis is no longer there to help you, no longer there to defend your system. And so that can lead to that human becoming very, just have a lot of medical problems, things like that. So when we bring that back to the hydroponic soil system comparison, a hydroponic system is kind of like a human that does not have their microbiome anymore, while a soil system is a healthy soil system is like a healthy human with their microbiome.
Because you can have a sterile soil system as well, right?
Yep. Well, as sterile as we can get it.
Huh.
It's hard. It can be hard to say, especially here on Earth with how many microbes we have. It can be a little bit difficult to make a system 100% sterile. But we try to, and that's why we have things like clean rooms, especially when we're developing rovers and other technology that we're going to be sending into space. We do it in clean rooms where people are completely dressed in the white coveralls and have masks on and hats on. It's because they're trying to prevent any microorganisms, any living organism from getting on this technology, because we don't want to contaminate space. And especially if we're looking for life in space, we don't want to find a cell or a microorganism and be like, aha, we found life. wait, it actually came from one of our scientists in the lab.
Whoops.
Oh, whoops.
I think they brought back some bacteria from the moon on accident, which they took to interpret that it was bacteria they brought to the moon also.
Mm-hmm. Yep. When we went to the moon, we were not as mindful about contamination and the like. So you see pictures of the Apollo astronauts, and they're like covered in like moon regolith and moon dust on their suits.
Mm.
Good thing there's nothing too nasty in there. Well,
Yeah.
or was there?
Yeah, exactly.
Oh. Well, I don't think we've had any health-related issues for those astronauts, so I think we're good.
Well, that's
COVID comes from the
interesting.
moon.
Gasp!
Well, so that's actually interesting, because isn't there a lot of radiation out on the way to the moon and back? It's surprising that there aren't greater health consequences for people that go to space, isn't it?
Yeah. So when it comes to radiation, pretty much the Earth's magnetic field that we have surrounding, like that goes into like low Earth orbit. It's pretty big around us. It protects us from a lot of the high radiation particles and solar flares that we get from the sun. And actually, that's one of the reasons why Mars has a lot of high energy particles that actually get to the surface. It's because Mars doesn't really have a magnetic field around it anymore. And that's another one of the reasons why its atmosphere is kind of blowing away into space.
Can you build one?
Can we build an atmosphere?
Magnetic field.
Can we build a
Can you
magnetic
give it some
field?
magnetic activity?
Or like, is that necessary for space agriculture, you mean? Or just in general, for humans?
Is a field something that can be built?
That is a philosophical question.
We'll get to that later.
That is
Okay.
We would probably have to ask a planetary engineer.
We'll find one later.
Yeah,
Got
we'll
it.
get back to you on that.
Okay. But yeah, that's one of the reasons why if we were to go to Mars and have agriculture on Mars, we would have to make sure that we have some good radiation shielding and grow things indoors because of these high radiation particles that are able to get through the atmosphere of Mars and hit the surface. It's actually an interesting question that I've considered as well, because we're doing research here on Earth to look at what high radiation can do to plants, especially with the concerns of the ozone layer. And so there's definitely been research on it.
You mean like
And
if the
it would
ozone
be-
layer is degraded? Or,
Yeah.
I see.
Mm-hmm. If the ozone layer is degraded, as well as in latitudes here on Earth that have higher radiation levels. For example, the closer you get to the equator, to really see how these different radiation levels affect plants. And so one thing that would be an interesting experiment to do if we did an agricultural experiment on Mars is to not only have plants growing in maybe a subterranean agricultural field, but maybe you also have an agricultural field out, still in an enclosed system, but more like a greenhouse where you can actually let some of those radiation rays come in to the agricultural system and see if the plants adapt. See how the plants adapt and see if you can have a system that becomes a unique Martian ecology. It would be very interesting. And some of the ways that we can prepare for doing experiments like that is by actually looking at the natural environment around us, looking at ecosystems here on Earth that are similar to what we would find on Mars. So similar soil environments. So what plants are growing in soils that are kind of more basalt sand, that are a little bit harsher. And there are definitely ecosystems here on Earth that have these similarities to what we would find on Mars. And so we should definitely be looking at the plants that are growing there, and the communities that have survived off of these plants as well.
And have you looked at these already? Do you kind of know what's going on over there?
Yeah. So one of my passions, you could say, is I'm very much into looking at and studying traditional ecological knowledge and traditional agricultural systems. So the agricultural systems of indigenous peoples.
Pre-industrial, basically, yeah?
Pretty much. Well, even pre-colonial as well.
If you go like to Europe and you look at, I don't know, pagan agricultural systems, would that be traditional ecological knowledge, or is that only applied to indigenous farming practices?
That's a very good question, actually. There are definitely traditional systems, like you said, traditional pagan systems that we can find in Europe. So you can definitely find traditional systems everywhere. It's just that, especially with Europe, it's kind of been overshadowed by the mass industrial movement of agriculture. Sure. So a lot of the times when people are talking about traditional agricultural systems, they tend to be talking more about like indigenous communities in South America, the native peoples of the Americas. The
idea is just that it's just opposed to industrialism, some sort of alternative to. Is that the appeal?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because these systems tend to be more in harmony with their ecological systems around them. Instead of trying to control and dominate the system, they understand how their landscape functions, what are the resources that they can pull from, but also replenish. And
it's all about balance again.
Yes, yeah. One of my favorite traditional agricultural systems, which is still in practice today, is the Chinampa system of Mesoamerica.
What is that?
The Chinampa system. Pretty much, if you've ever heard of the Aztec civilization.
Oh yeah, they were cool. They were really friendly when we came to see them.
They thought we were gods.
Whoa, that's pretty cool.
Yeah, you can see us in some of their paintings.
I'm gonna have to check that out. It's like I know them.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So, one of the common topics that's talked about when we're talking about the Aztec civilization is like the floating gardens of the Aztec capital.
Ooh.
These gardens that seem to be floating on the lake of the Aztec capital.
Turned out to be a good idea?
Well, these floating gardens were actually not floating. They were actually pretty much built from the bottom of the lake bed up. And so the Aztec people and the people who predated the Aztecs, who were also using this system, they pretty much realized that they could pretty much layer nutrient-rich mud and water reeds and other organic matter on top of each other until they kind of built this column up to the surface of the lake. And then they could start to grow a biodiversity of crops on top of it. This could be squash, corn, beans, trees, etc. And these systems were extremely sustainable because they were using nutrient-rich materials to build it, but also because they actually built it in a lake. So there was continuous nutrient-rich waters that would come from the mountains down into the lake and wash through these columns. And just because of the pretty much movement of the water as well, these systems never had, were never, what's the word for it? never swamped over by water. They pretty much built them tall enough to be able to meet with the highest amount of water they would get, and then be able to meet with the lowest amount of water
They were
would get
never
with
inundated.
Yes, exactly.
This sounds a lot like what you were saying about field ponics, did you call it? The sort of the blend of soil and hydroponics. Yeah,
exactly. And that's the thing. Pretty much the entire point of me sharing the Chinampas system is that there's these techniques and there's this knowledge and this understanding of ecological systems that we are now being able to explain with science. So we pretty much had these people who were able to create these systems and gain this knowledge. And then we can, as we bring this knowledge forward in a very respectful manner of the people and the culture, we can start using science to say why what they were doing was sustainable, why what they were doing was actually good for the environment and actually didn't destroy the environment, unlike some of the more intensive practices that the Europeans brought with European colonialism.
So you can investigate the sort of mechanism of, first of all, you can sort of outline the fact that it is actually beneficial by systematically measuring the system, right? Or measure the system with the system. Systematically measuring the phenomena. And then on top of that, you can provide a mechanism for why it is so.
Well, we talk about this all the time, this idea that humans have a tendency of engineering things really, really well before they actually can explain them in terms of science. Because science is kind of a recent thing, right?
Yeah, science is a recent thing, but experimentation is not.
Yeah, and that's kind of engineering. And so there's these two branches of science. There's the
You mean like you can shoot someone with a bow and arrow before you understand the aerodynamics of how the arrow flew and how gravity affected it and...
Or what death is.
The mechanism. Or death.
Yeah, exactly. I think that really hits it on the head. But there's all these things that humans have been doing, and now humans are like, okay, we want to go to Mars. And so you have to pick through the history and be able to figure out, well, what stuff in the history actually worked that's going to let us actually go to Mars.
Yeah, exactly. We should not forget the knowledge and lessons that we've learned for generations here on Earth. When we go to the moon or to Mars or beyond, we should definitely not be repeating the same mistakes that we've made with our agricultural and ecological systems here on Earth either.
Let me ask you a question. Do you feel like this is like an escape from this industrial paradigm? Like if you guys get off of Earth into space, you'll be able to make it away from this paradigm? Or do you think that these wisdoms that you're uncovering can be translated back into Earth culture as well?
Whoa.
That is a wonderful question, because it also parallels the question of why go into space at all, and what's the benefit of going into space for people here on Earth.
You must get that a lot in hard times.
I do. Yeah, so
what do you say to them?
Well, I'm definitely not an apocalyptic thinker.
That's good.
I definitely don't think we should go into space to escape Earth. I don't think that's the right way to think about it. I think that's a dangerous way to think about it. I think that there are a lot of parallels and there are a lot of similar challenges between growing agriculture in space and growing agriculture here on Earth. And that the lessons and the experiments that we've run here on Earth can spin into how we develop systems in space, but also the lessons that we learn from having agriculture in space can also come back to here on Earth. Because once we realize how difficult it is to build an agricultural ecological system in space, it will really show us how precious our ecological systems here on Earth and how unique they are. So we should definitely be preserving them and doing conservation work and restoration work with our ecological systems here on Earth. And if we are able to actually learn how to build an agricultural ecological system from scratch on Mars, which is very much a bare rock, very barren landscape, then we can take those lessons as well and apply them back here on Earth, where we have extreme environments. We have changing environments that are changing due to climate change and the intensive agricultural practices we've been using. And we can use this knowledge of, for example, soil development, how soil develops from bare rock to a healthy, fertile soil that we see, and understanding that process and what goes into that.
So it's like an exercise. It's like weightlifting or something. You're doing this exercise in resilience and in doing something that's very difficult in order to actually strengthen your base as well. Exactly. That's
a good way to put it. Yeah.
Well, because otherwise it can kind of seem like magic, right? Because I think that probably a lot of people on Earth don't spend a lot of time thinking about, well, where did the soil come from? And the line between rock and Earth probably seems pretty magical if they think about it at all.
Yeah, just ask yourself the question. You look outside your window. Well, you guys see space outside your window, but you look outside. You got a little guy right there. If you look outside your window, or if you look at your ecological system outside, what did it look like 10 years ago? What did it look like 50, 100, 1,000 years ago? It's going to be completely different from what you see it as today. Unless we're in an old growth forest, then maybe not. But our ecological systems change over time, especially with the human presence and the huge changes that we can make as a species. So it's a very interesting question, and it actually goes into this theory of ecological succession. Pretty much, what are the steps or the processes that an ecosystem develops or goes through over time to go from a barren, rocky landscape to an ecological system that we see today, whether that's a forest or a prairie grass system, or even like the tundra as well. Just how did these ecosystems form? And these are important questions to ask, because when we go into a desert here on Earth, or when we go to the desert of Mars, we have to understand how we could form an ecological system from scratch.
That's balanced.
That's pretty much what you're going to be doing. Yeah.
Like not just an ecological system, like you don't want a system of two organisms. It seems like you're really interested in this idea of tensions, different species pushing against one another and holding things in place.
Yeah, you want a biodiversity of species because that allows you to have a multifunctional system. It allows you to be able to have different ecological services in your system. You have species that help with nutrient cycling, species that help with water retention. And when I say species, you're not only talking about plants, but you're also talking about the microorganisms. You may have insects as well in your system, things like that. So
it's good for everybody.
Yeah, it's
win-win
good
situation.
For everybody.
Well, I have a question. Are humans good for everybody?
Ooh.
Some days, not others.
it's a good question because we have definitely seen how humans can destroy a landscape, but we have also seen how humans can live in balance with a landscape as well. And we see the work of people trying to restore landscapes. I mean, this decade, 2021 to 2030, the United Nations have named it the decade of ecosystem restoration, I believe. So
there's been really productive land management, right? There's been land management that actually helped it be a better place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's really because we're bringing forward these practices and this knowledge that is based in traditional ecological knowledge and thinking about sustainability and natural resiliency versus coerced resiliency.
So there's a matter of consent there. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Well, yeah, how do you negotiate consent with the natural world? They don't really have an advocate. There's not like a lawyer who's like, well, excuse me, you can't do this. There's not like a moose lawyer or like a soil lawyer who's keeping these things on the up and up.
They got antlers.
Are those lawyers?
Well, that's where our government systems come into play, because our governments are kind of like the leading law bodies that we follow, like having the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States that helps to put rules and regulations in place to make sure that we're kind of kept in place with what we can do with our environment. You also have a lot of the programs and committees of the United Nations, which work to make sure that people aren't, for example, doing illegal trading of animals and different plants, and making sure that someone just doesn't come into an ecological system and just completely like deforest it, things like that. So we do kind of have safeguards in place, but not to get into politics that much, but there have definitely been people who have gained these seats of power in politics who have not had sustainability and ecological restoration and resiliency in mind.
Because they're trying to make money.
Money and power. And then, like, why should somebody care about the future when they'll be gone by then?
Presumably their children will still be around. Are these people not having children?
Maybe they hate their children.
Oh, I never considered that. Maybe they do.
It's sometimes you wonder, because it's like, why, even with the possibility of things going terribly wrong by your actions, like, why won't you at least do this for your children if you have children?
Do you think that there's a sense that it'll be possible to escape the consequences? Like, if there's somewhere to go, if there's some fancy space station with some fancy farms and some fancy ways of being able to escape the chaos on Earth, and, you know, you're really rich because...
That was going to be our business idea once we got to Earth.
That's right? True. Should we not have told anyone? Don't tell anyone.
We're going to get Earth rich. Come on.
It's true. It's true.
Well, that's definitely a danger, because, like you said, if we get to the point where our Earth becomes like very food insecure and is being affected by climate change, and it becomes very hard and difficult for people, the people with the money and the power could potentially easily escape onto like a spacecraft, or if we have habitations in low Earth orbit or on the moon or Mars, while people who don't have the money, who are pretty much
earthbound.
Well, to some extent, this happens today, right? It seems like space isn't the escape, but people who have a lot of power on Earth are able to sort of wall themselves off from these problems, perhaps.
Sure.
I don't know, I haven't been there in a while, but it seems like a long-running problem.
Yeah, this doesn't seem like a new human problem, right? Things fall apart. There's people that are rich that think they can get away from it,
Well, they
but
do.
Mhm.
For a while.
for a while, I think that there's this collapse that can happen that no one can escape from. And it's short-sighted to think that you can escape it, right? No matter how rich you are.
Yeah. And that's why it's so important to engage the public, to engage communities, to engage people who want to go into careers in this, or people who aren't in the career but are still interested and still care about these questions and these problems and these challenges, because it's really like we gain power and we gain the ability to make a difference when we stand together to address these challenges and come forward and say this is like an issue that we all care about. And as more people are informed about it and educated about it, people can join in the conversation as well as bring their different backgrounds and their experiences and their knowledge and help us come up with different solutions that we could have never thought of before unless we invite everyone to the table.
My question is about the ways that humans choose to make decisions and the way that scientific explanations play into that. So, if you allow me to ramble for a moment, let's say you have a situation where you're talking about the well-being of an ecosystem. And there's a scientific explanation for how the ecosystem has come to be a certain way. And there's an agreement in general about the fact that that explanation is the right explanation, let's say.
Correct.
Correct explanation, yeah. Right is mostly for moral things. So let's keep with correct and incorrect. So if you have an explanation that's agreed upon to be correct, what if that explanation actually isn't correct? What if it is giving too much weight to some kind of civilization priors that you have? Do you know what I mean?
Give us an example.
Well,
like CO2?
Like CO2, or I like to think about it in geological terms. CO2 is a little difficult because it's so hot, you know? But, yeah, exactly. Geological terms. So you have a story of how these rocks came to be the way that they are, or how this landscape came to look the way that it does, or how this desert came to be here, versus how this jungle came to be here. And the decision that you make going forward relies on your explanation. But what if your explanation isn't the correct one? How do you deal with that?
You know, that's really what science is all about, where we, with the current technology and resources that we have, there's only so much that we can experiment on, that we can gain information on. And we've seen through science that there have been long decades of time where we've believed certain things and they've kind of been considered fact, or pretty much everyone just bases everything they do off of those scientific explanations, because that just seems other people did the experiment and they got the same answers, and it's just like, okay, it seems to make sense, so we're going to do it this way. But then you have a new technology come forward, and you have this new technology that is able to suddenly reveal something that you didn't see before, and it completely either changes what you thought before or adds on to it.
Do you have an example of seeing this happen?
Let's see.
We're always on the lookout for these sorts of examples because they're hard to come by.
Yeah. You know? Yeah. It's so I guess
phlogiston.
This is a little bit controversial right now in the microbiology industry. So
yeah, we love controversy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We've
So,
heard that YouTube loves controversy too, you know?
oh geez, let's not.
I'm
Let's
kidding.
not. Yeah. So for decades, we've had microorganisms pretty much characterized as eukaryotes and prokaryotes. And within the prokaryotes, we've had like bacteria and archaea. And then you have the eukaryotic cells.
And like fungi are eukaryotes, right? Or they're
Oh.
I'm sorry. I didn't mean to do this to us.
Back to the controversy. Back to the controversy.
Effectively derailed. I'm sorry.
Let's see. Just a second.
Because they're carnivorous, you know? I've seen these
they're
videos.
eukaryotes. Okay, yeah. I was like, I'm pretty sure they're eukaryotes, but then I was doubting myself. And you know, it happens. It's like, that's why we have textbooks. That's why we have Google to double check ourselves, because, you know, we're stuffing all this knowledge into our heads as students, as researchers, as just people living our everyday lives. And sometimes it's like, I should know that because that is a fundamental thing. But I'm blanking in the moment.
That's what Earth Google's
anyway.
for.
Well, you're not a fungusologist, you know? Like, it's forgivable.
Mm-hmm.
If you're a fungusologist, then maybe we could have a conversation about how important it is to know that, but...
Back to the controversy.
Back to the controversy, but I want to make sure that the difference between eukaryote and prokaryote is complexity of cell structures, is like, they have mitochondria. It's mitochondria, right?
Yeah, so pretty much bacteria and archaea domains, they're primarily single-celled organisms, while eukaryotic can be multi-celled. And prokaryotes are pretty much the smallest, simplest, most ancient cells as well. So pretty much the majority of microbiologists have agreed that we've had the separation of eukaryotes and prokaryotes. Well, I believe in the last decade, maybe 2 decades, it might have been 2000s, early 2000s, but there were these new archaea that were discovered called Asgard archaea.
Whoa.
And
isn't it like a Viking fortress, Asgard?
Yeah, a lot of the Asgard archaea are actually named after like Loki.
I love it.
Loki archaea, Asgard archaea, yeah, all of that. So we're just nerds in all this.
I love it.
But pretty much the discovery of these Asgard archaea, just because we've like developed more advanced techniques to analyze microorganisms and analyze their genetics and things like that. It seems like eukaryotes potentially may have developed from Asgard archaea. There seems to be some kind of connection here, some ancestral line here, just because of some similarities that we're seeing. And there's definitely a lot of papers on this. I'm not an expert on this, so I can't speak as much to the science behind it. But
it's like a case where the phenomena has become more clear. And as it's more clear, the explanation changes.
Exactly. So there's a movement of microbiologists who are pretty much saying we should completely drop the term prokaryote.
Whoa.
Yeah. They think it's kind of a false representation of these groups of microorganisms. And so this is an example of new knowledge, new techniques that come forward that can shift the way that we think or see something, because we now just have new knowledge and something was uncovered that we couldn't test or see before just because we were limited in what we had at the time to help us with that.
Well, this kind of strikes at the human conversation about what is complexity or where multicellularity came from, right? So something that's always kind of disturbed me is that there's this break between single-celled eukaryotes and multi-celled eukaryotes, right? So there's a eukaryote, like euglena or something, I don't know, algae, like these little things that float around that are single-celled. And then there's eukaryotes with hundreds of cells, and then you have, humans and all the other big ones. But there's not a continuous line of 1 cell, 2 cell, 3 cell, 4 cell. And so where does that complexity come from? Couldn't it have just been, like, what if a biofilm evolved into a human? Like, what if the first eukaryotes were already organisms? You ever think about that? Maybe it's just me. But I think that this redefinition is what helps you come up to explanation, but it's going to take decades for this re-explanation to be negotiated and considered and argued, and at the end of the day, this happens in all kinds of disciplines that humans might still be kind of blind to, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I remember going through elementary school, middle school, high school, and learning certain scientific concepts. And then I get to college and graduate school, and it's like, okay, that wasn't necessarily correct, or that was kind of wrong.
Like the Bohr model of the atom is not it.
Progress.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, science is moving forward at a faster pace, just because of not only our advances in technology, but also because our increasing interconnectedness globally, where scientists can now connect with each other and share their research and talk with each other, as well as we're still working on it, but also just allowing more people from diverse backgrounds to have the ability and the rights to be able to pursue different fields of research and be able to add their perspectives and their experiences into the conversation as well. But we really need to work on that, because we still have a lot of systemic problems, especially in academia, when it comes to excluding
back to the monoculture again.
Certain people. Exactly.
It all comes back to, it seems like you guys could almost define health as like a multicultural system of tension that really pushes against one another, and you have this balance. It's really interesting.
Health is having someone to wrestle with.
Yeah. Lots of someones.
Yep. And to kind of like also bring this a little bit back to space agriculture. Also, one of the reasons why you want a biodiverse system is because monocultures are inherently unstable. A great example of this is the banana industry here on Earth, where pretty much the bananas that we have, especially in a lot of Western countries, is pretty much the same banana. And what do I mean by that? Pretty much these bananas are clones of each other. So you have these huge fields, these huge banana farms, and it's pretty much just one banana that's been cloned multiple times. And so it's a monoculture not only of a crop, but also a monoculture of genetics as well. And we saw a couple of decades ago, I'm blanking on the date specifically, but there was was it a bacteria or a fungus? Pretty much there was a pathogen that came through and almost completely wiped out the banana industry, just because this monoculture of plants and monoculture of genetics allowed that pathogen to pretty much just latch onto everything, because it pretty much had no competition or nothing to stop it.
And it's not good for the pathogen at the end of the day, because it kills off all its food. It's like good for no one.
It's good for no one. Exactly. And so this applies to space agriculture because we don't want like an unknown biovector to come into our agricultural system and completely wipe it out when we're on Mars and suddenly we don't have our food system. That would not be good. So having a biodiversity there and genetic diversity is very important to prevent things like that from happening, as well as other things. But also with this idea of diversity, having a diversity of ideas and people and experiences that are being included and being welcomed and listened to allows you to have a more resilient and a system with more solution pathways that you can take, because people are
they can imagine more
differences of ideas. Yeah,
they can imagine more possibilities, right? Your background and your history.
More chances for a good idea.
Yep.
So we've taken a lot of your time. I have one question I love to ask everybody that I talk to on Earth before we sign off. And I want to know, I think I might know the answer to this already, but what do you think is the biggest threat facing your species in the next near future? 100 years, 10 years, whatever, 5 minutes?
So one of the biggest threats, I think, as a soil scientist, especially in someone who's working in the agricultural industry here on Earth as well, is the loss and degradation of arable land. With the amount of land that we have to create into agriculture to be able to support our population. And when I say support the population, there are still groups of people in countries that are completely food insecure and are not getting the food that they need. So there's even unequal distribution of food as well. And so the loss of arable land, the degradation of soils is definitely something that can lead to disruptions in our food chains and lead to just further challenges for people who are very what's the word? Vulnerable, yes. I was like very much affected, very vulnerable to these kinds of changes. And we've learned that with the pandemic. We've learned that with the extreme weather that's happened in Australia, in California, in Texas just this past week, where we're in these areas. There have been empty shelves of food, disruptions to our food chain. And just with that, and then you add on restriction of arable land and loss of arable land due to soil degradation, it becomes a tough situation. And so that's why the research that I'm doing, even though I do have like that space element of looking at space agriculture, I also look at how we can revitalize and regenerate and conserve soils here on Earth to try to stop this potential and upcoming challenge from becoming a reality.
Well, it sounds like you're hard at work figuring out ways to fix it, so that's good. Yep.
We're working towards it as soil scientists.
You should get back to work.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
I feel bad keeping you. I'm depriving humanity of your services.
Indeed.
It's all good. We need to talk so people understand the science, and so you guys can have this knowledge as well and share it to humans as well as anyone else that you meet in the universe.
Where can people find you if they want to find out more about your work?
Yeah, so I am on social media, on Instagram at astroecologist, on Twitter at astroecomorgan. I'm also in the process of creating my own website right now. So that should be coming up in the next couple of weeks. And then you can also check out my company, Deep Space Ecology, at deepspaceecology.com.
Excellent. Thank you so much for taking the time, Morgan.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Take care.
Our
Good
pleasure.
luck.
Bye.
Bye.